If you live in California, have or love children, you are probably very concerned about our public K12 schools. To know what to do and who to believe, you've got to have accurate, meaningful data and analysis. Right now it's very confusing because you are not getting an accurate picture of where we really are. The following new report will help you understand the full truth. Hopefully it will motivate you to get involved, to pass along this information, and to fight for the reforms that will really give our kids a great education. The state of California educates 1 in 8 American children. Everyone wants all our children to win. To do that, we've got to face the truth, even when it hurts. I suspect this information will be viewed as confrontational and thus become controversial. That's in part because up until now, others haven't looked at the data from what I believe is the right perspective. Don't be surprised if our educators are the ones who object the most. That's because it will make a decade of hard work by millions of people seem wasted. The data that they've been using has been accurate. Unfortunately, without the right lens to view it with, one is drawn to inaccurate conclusions of progress and how our children really are doing. If we can get past those feelings of hurt, this new analysis should change the entire way our state approaches this mounting crisis. We'll look at how the state and our large districts are really doing, and we'll dissect a few small districts in more detail when and where it can be instructive. Some of the specific data may only be relevant to some. In those cases, we try to limit the time on those slides. Feel free to stop the presentation if it pertains to you. I got involved when our district completely failed, academically and fiscally. We received the largest per capita bailout in California state history. 25% of our kids and families left the district. Roughly half drop out, and 78% of the remaining few that do graduate are not ready for college. In addition, we've seen the closure of schools, ongoing cuts, and annual layoffs. And if you do the math, it means that roughly 1% of our minority males can be projected to graduate from college. And while it may seem like I'm picking on our district, it is in no way uncommon. This is happening all across the state, no matter where you live. Yet the headlines offer us a mix of good and bad news. Frankly, it gets confusing, especially somebody that's not paying close attention. We're here to help you understand the full truth. I'm sure you know of the federal No Child Left Behind law that was enacted to drive better outcomes in school reform. What you may not know is that while it's a federal law that leverages federal dollars to get the states to implement it, the standards or tests themselves are created and administered by the individual states. Opponents contend that teachers are teaching to the test, that it's not funded, and that it doesn't drive the right things. Advocates contend that we need accountability, that we need measures to know where our problems are and whether or not we're making progress. The main measures that come out of No Child Left Behind are the API, or Academic Performance Index, which really measures how we performed on the test, and the AYP, or Adequate Yearly Progress Indicator, which indicates a group's proficiency in subjects such as math or reading. These measures are supposed to be the cornerstone of our accountability laws. In short, No Child Left Behind was intended to give us an objective way to tell whether or not and when our schools were making real progress. The question is, are our children and our schools performing any better than they were 10 years ago? Have we learned anything? Are today's schools any better than they were? Have state, district, and school leaders done anything to meaningfully improve outcomes? Do our kids have a better chance at beating the odds? Is our nation any more competitive? And most importantly, has it helped the local kids we all know and love? Well, let's see. District superintendents, school boards, and annual reports are telling the public that they transformed nearly entire districts into significantly higher performing schools, and that our children across the entire state are making great gains in academic achievement, and that this progress is undeniable. Our state's educational leaders are telling the press and the public that we should be proud of and even celebrate these gains, that our schools have gotten better each and every year over the past decade, and that our students are doing better than ever. At the state level, there has been significant and steady increases in our students' API scores. The data shows great gains in student math and reading proficiency as well. At least up until this year, our district's API score showed significant and steady progress, as do our neighboring districts. So do the districts in our state's largest cities. They are even using color-coded maps to show how failing, in this case red, low-performing schools, have been transformed into blue, high-performing schools, and how now only a few red, underperforming schools remain. This kind of factual data would lead most people to conclude that these districts had made undeniable progress. As a result, some districts have even produced beautiful videos to tell the public that it's working and that test scores are reaching all-time highs. This sounds like great news. Maybe our state's education crisis is finally behind us. While this data is correct, unfortunately, the conclusion is not. The truth is that over the last decade, our state's real API scores are flat and failing. Right about now, you're probably asking, how did you come up with that? A relevant, though imperfect analogy comes from physics. If a student is sitting on a moving bus, the mother on the curb sees her child driving away quickly, but to the kid next to them on the bus, the child is sitting relatively still. California's API scores are a bit like this analogy, only the California education train really isn't moving at all. It just looks that way until you see the full picture. To determine where we really are and how fast we really are moving, we've got to correlate and adjust our API data based on other relevant known fixed objects, otherwise known as other tests. Fortunately for this analysis, we've got a rock-solid test as a reference. It's our national test, otherwise known as the NAEP, which stands for the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's a true benchmark to compare our state test results against. This data can be used to help us determine what our real API scores are, where our state, schools, districts, and students really stand. When we correct for this offset or API inflation, we learn some very interesting and telling information. The rest of this presentation details a number of critical things we all need to know. That is, if we are serious about really improving our children's chances of success. The first thing that jumps out is that, unfortunately, California's NAEP scores over the past decade have been dead flat, meaning that our students' real subject mastery in reading and math hasn't improved one bit. Even worse, it tells us that our students are roughly a full year behind the average public school student across the nation, and yet another year behind the average private school student. How is that possible? How could we be making so much progress on one test and none on another test of essentially the same kind of material? The answer is they couldn't. California's API gains do not represent any real improvement in subject mastery. The state's scores are inflating and need to be adjusted or handicapped to show a school's and/or a district's real academic performance levels. To calculate a real API score, you need to subtract the state's false API growth from the state's published score. As you can see, that calls the notion of undeniable progress into serious question, as the full truth shows that districts that appear to have made significant progress really haven't made any at all. In other words, our schools have gotten no better at teaching our children, and they've not put the decade to good use. This calculation would be a lot more complicated had California schools actually improved their NAEP scores over this period of time. In fact, this adjustment may not have even been possible. But because our scores were dead flat, this adjustment becomes both easy and valid. And as you'll see, it also makes the task of identifying real progress in serious educational models infinitely easier. Our district's API scores, like every other district I've looked at, track the state's rate of change, albeit at a lower level. And when you look at the district's performance by demographic, you see performance is essentially flat, and that despite professed goals, our schools have made no progress in closing any gaps, and that none of the individual groups are doing well enough to brag, even comparatively, about their outcomes, as I've heard some do. The results are even clearer when they are shown at full scale, with corresponding letter grades. As you can see, we've got a lot more work to do, and that when one adds the real scores of our district's middle schools and high schools, which to me represent the ultimate performance or funnel to an educational system, that not one of them really passes the test. Frankly, our high school outcomes are downright scary, seemingly needing a new letter grade to properly indicate performance. Is this really acceptable? Are we ever going to do anything about this? Is it any wonder why our young men and women can't find jobs? Our kids are not and will not be prepared to compete if we continue to allow this. Not in this area, not in California, not in America, and certainly not in the world. I know the preceding information must seem awful harsh to the hardworking people in our community, but this should not be acceptable, and I've learned it's completely unnecessary. Well, if there's any silver lining, at least we're not alone. When you look at our neighbors, you'll see none of them have improved outcomes either. In fact, the performance of the two districts that most people would have said were the best run districts have seen a significant drop in average student outcomes. Part of the story is changing demographics and changing economics. But both of these districts should study this deeper, as traditionally higher performing groups started falling before the Great Recession, too. Another mistake people make when comparing APIs is to only look at the raw score and assume a higher scoring school is staffed with great teachers and run better. It may simply be that the students that make up that school come from better circumstances and are better prepared. I contend that you need to look at a school's absolute rank as well as its similar schools rank. As you can see, some schools have lower absolute ranks, but rank high compared to schools with similar demographics. And some schools that do well on the absolute scale do poorly when compared to similar schools. It may be that a school with a higher similar schools rank has better teachers and is run better than a school with a lower similar schools rank, even if the latter has a better API score or absolute rank. Now let's quickly look at the state's large urban districts and see if they're making any progress. As I showed you earlier, none of the state's large school districts appears to have come up with any breakthroughs, and only Oakland appears to have had any meaningful gains. When you adjust San Jose's scores by the state's API inflation, you see little change overall or by demographic. The same is true of San Francisco. If anything, their performance has fallen a little bit over the last few years. While Sacramento's gaps are inherently narrower, performance is nevertheless flat overall and by demographic. By contrast, Los Angeles' data shows two distinct outcomes. Asians and whites at least pass the test, whereas blacks, Hispanics, and the poor fail and at some distance away. The same can be said of San Diego, but the overall district's performance is likely up some versus Los Angeles's due to a higher mix of the different demographics. On an absolute basis, Oakland has its challenges. There is some improvement from this district. It's the state's most improved urban district over the past 5 years. Looking at the graph, their gains have come mostly with Hispanic and poor students. So far, they've made very little real improvement, if any, with black, white, and Asian students. Despite a couple of superintendents that I really respect, and I don't say that often, they, like the rest of California's public schools, have not made significant breakthroughs in real subject mastery nor in narrowing achievement gaps. So to sum things up so far, the real truth is our districts are not improving outcomes, nor are they closing achievement gaps. That said, As mentioned, Oakland schools have actually shown some improvement. So let's take a little closer look to see where Oakland schools have and haven't improved. Overall, Oakland schools' real performance has risen about 50 points or half a letter grade over the past decade. Not to be critical, but to show how hard it is to move this mountain. At this rate, it would take another 15 years for the district just to reach a passing C- level, and 30 years to move the district to a solid B. As previously shown, Oakland's overall performance for all students from kindergarten through high school is improving some. Whites and Asians are getting C's, but outcomes are still a big problem for Black and Hispanic kids. To better understand where they were improving, we separated out the district's middle and high schools. We wanted to know if the gains were transferring to the end product, graduates with skills to attend college and/or move to a good, well-paying career. What we found was that Oakland's middle and high school performance hasn't improved yet, meaning that most of the gains are still confined to elementary schools. That's great, but as I'm sure their people would agree, we've got to do more and/or play smarter. Looking at a couple of their largest high schools by themselves, you find that none of the school's subgroups was really passing the test, and their Black and Hispanic kids were really performing at a very disappointingly low level. So the long and short of it is that California's public K-12 schools are not making real progress, particularly when it comes to teens, and it's a mistake to believe that they are. If I am wrong, please tell me what exactly was it that fixed all of our schools? What specifically are our educators doing to improve achievement this much, everywhere across the state at the same time? And how do we possibly explain away the fact that our performance has been flat on so many other indicators for over 40 years? What breakthrough to the design of our public schools happened over this period of time? I mean, what game changer was there? Why did every district improve at roughly the same rate? Well, to me, it seems like it's a little bit too good to be true. I encourage you to think, to ask yourself, which is really the more likely scenario? That all of a sudden, without being able to point to what caused it, that all of our state's schools improved this significantly and steadily, or that this analysis is correct, and it's time we got serious about really reforming our public schools. The good news is there are some schools that are winning, that are getting real A's and B's and beating the odds. But for the most part, they tend to be charter schools. This chart shows the actual API scores of a handful of winners. Even after adjusting their AP scores, you'll find that these schools really are achieving breakthrough performance with their students and their schools. The magnitude of their real gains is night and day versus our standard district schools. In fact, the only thing keeping some of these schools from going higher is that the API test itself doesn't allow them to get higher scores. When you compare the kind of progress the winners are making versus the bulk of our schools, there is no comparison. We are long overdue to roll out the lessons learned to all our students. We don't have any more time to waste. We know what to do. It's time to get to it. We've got to stop letting excuses, failed dogma, and politics get in the way. Our children's and America's future depends on it. These winners are proving what's possible, and that any kid from anywhere can win. But if and only if we are committed to doing what's necessary. One turnaround champion serves communities where 90% of the kids live in poverty, and English is a second language to 70% of their homes. But since 2001, this school's API scores have gone from the low 400s to 990 out of 1,000. That's not the score of their best student. That's the school's average. In other words, the API test isn't hard enough for the students in their school. Their school produced a whopping 60% of their district's passing AP calculus students, even though their school represents only 1% of the district's overall population. As you probably already guessed, they get nearly every one of their kids into great colleges. In fact, Last year, colleges from around the world gave a total of $3 million in scholarships to the students in their graduating class. That means nearly every one of their students received a college scholarship. And they did all this for about $1,000 less per pupil than the average school in California spends. What do you think that means to these children, to their families, and to their communities? Will schools and children like this help or hurt a city's crime statistics? Will they need more or less police? Will it help or hurt their economic and business development prospects? Is it not the key to revitalization without regentrification? Results like these are possible with children from far tougher circumstances than we have. But if and only if we are willing to take off our rose-colored glasses and get deadly serious about doing what's absolutely necessary. So am I claiming that charter schools are better than traditional public schools? No, not at all. At least not automatically. But their winners absolutely are. And it's time we all focus on and learn from and do what these winners do. That or get out of the way. Because this cannot continue. The consequences are clear. Frankly, we're seeing them today. We were warned, and we've known what to do for decades. Californians, we have an election coming up. Both measures are asking you for more money to fund education. If one of these measures passes, we won't approve another tax for years. So we better get this one right. It counts. I suggest you do your homework and be careful who you listen to. If you found this analysis interesting and the information as important as we do, please forward it to all your friends. To learn what to do, to learn what we've learned from the winners, look us up at neweraschools.com. And finally, I'd like to thank and credit Alan Bonsteel, whose San Francisco Chronicle op-ed about a year ago inspired this analysis. Thank you for making the time, and please consider joining us and others like us in our fight to revolutionize American K-12 education. Take care.